My name's Regina Staten, like I said. I've been in this field for about 13 years now. The first 7 were at the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources, Office of Coastal Management. I started out there as a permit analyst, and then I moved on to become the permit supervisor for the western portion of the state. I've been here at Providence for 6 years now, and I am the Deputy Director of the Natural Resource and Coastal Services Group. Sorry, folks. Having a little difficulty, I'm sorry. So first of all, I wanted to show you what the coastal zone boundary looked like. And as you see, if you look on the eastern part of the state, it starts about St. Tammany and it follows all the way along to the Calcasieu, Cameron area. And this is just to give you an idea, if you have a project that you're planning or if you have assets in this area, that this may be something to think about of a little bit more complex process of permitting in the coastal zone. So a couple of things I wanted to mention, just some examples of what would trigger permitting were things like pipeline flow line installation, meter stations, valve stations, residential communities, marinas, even maintenance on existing pipelines and installation of utilities. So just, again, there are many, many examples, but I just wanted to kind of name a few. So I'm going to start out talking about the 2 main permitting agencies in the coastal zone. So the 2 main players are Department of Natural Resources, Office of Coastal Management, or OCM for short, and then there's the New Orleans District of Corps of Engineers. And I'm really going to strictly speak about the New Orleans District for this talk, because if you submit a permit application for work in the coastal zone, it's actually a joint permit application between the New Orleans District of the Corps and OCM. So I'm going to limit my discussion today to the New Orleans District. So of course there are other players, Wildlife and Fisheries, U.S. Fish, DEQ, SHPO, State Lands, just to kind of name a few. And OCM has what's called a memorandum of understanding with some of these agencies, for example, Wildlife and Fisheries, that allows that Wildlife and Fisheries concerns or comments to be incorporated into OCM's permit process. So if they look at your project and they have a concern about it, they'll provide a comment to OCM, and then OCM will then ask about it. And then in addition to that, they may provide conditions to OCM, and then OCM would incorporate those conditions into their permit authorization. So that MOU allows that for that sort of coordination. For the most part, I'm actually going to talk today about the permitting section at OCM, the state permitting section, but there are 2 other groups I wanted to mention just briefly. There's the Federal Consistency Group. And so what that does, if you're doing a project on federal property or some sort of federal action, when you submit a permit application to OCM, they may look at it at that state level and then decide, because it's that federal action, they're going to send it to the consistency group. And that consistency group is responsible for making sure that your project is consistent with the state program. On a little bit of a side note, I wanted to mention that if you're doing work on a federal property, then that will most likely trigger, if, for example, a National Wildlife Refuge, that would trigger a special use permit, which would also be incorporated into that consistency determination process. So there's also a local permitting. And so the state has the responsibility to look at a project and deem whether they're going to keep it in the permitting section at the state, or if they're going to send it on to the local branch of a coastal zone office. There are 12 parishes in the state, in the Louisiana's coastal zone, that have local coastal management offices, which means they've gone through the process and they are authorized to issue coastal use permits. You would still go through the core process the exact same way, but for that, instead of dealing with the state office in Baton Rouge, you would actually deal with that at a parish level. For example, if you're building a residential community in St. Tammany, it's in the coastal zone, you submit a permit application, you're not impacting anything that would make it a state concern. They may choose to to send it to that local St. Tammany Coastal Management Office to process. I want to point out sort of the main reasons to keep it as a state concern is if you're impacting state water bottoms, or if it's oil and gas activity. So both of those are automatically deemed what they call a state concern, and you're going to get a permit. You're going to work with the Baton Rouge State Permitting Office for that. On top of it, even if you are doing an oil gas activity and your project is deemed a state concern, and so you're dealing with that permitting group, then you may also have to get a parish permit. And that parish permit could be from the Office of Coastal Management Office, or it could be from Public Works or Planning and Zoning. So those are kind of, in a nutshell, all of the players that could potentially have a hand in your permit process. So I want to briefly touch on the regulatory authority for OCM and the Corps. So OCM implements the Louisiana Coastal Resource Program under the authority of the State and Local Coastal Resource Management Act. And then the Corps, their regulatory authority and responsibilities are based on Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, and then Section 103 of the Marine Protection, Research, and Sanctuaries Act of 1972. So even though they function under different regulations, in my opinion, their objectives are pretty similar. It's all about avoidance and minimizations to impacts to jurisdictional waters or coastal resources. And I'll touch, I'll go into a little bit more detail about coastal resources and just the definition of coastal resources in just a second. And it's really that balance between the objective of a project and those avoidance and minimizations of impacts. So again, they have similar objectives, but they operate under different regulations. So I want to give you a couple of in my opinion, pretty significant differences if you're trying to permit a project in the coastal zone versus out of the coastal zone. So I mentioned a second ago about coastal resources. So OCM has a little broader interest when it comes to what they regulate. So yes, they have an interest in wetlands, but it's also what they call unique ecological features, which are things like cheniers, beaches, salt domes. I do want to mention quickly, the definition of a wetland in OCM doesn't quite match the definition of a wetland at the Corps. So as most of us know, the definition of a wetland or how the Corps determines if an area is a wetland is they meet the three parameters: soils, hydrology, and vegetation. And at the state level, however, if you've met one or two of those parameters, they may still call something a wetland. So just that's kind of a big one to kind of keep in mind. Also, if you're working outside the coastal zone, you have the ability to use nationwide permits. For the most part, and I know there are exceptions to this, for the most part, nationwide permits are not used in the coastal zone. They have programmatic general permits that are specifically designed, that the Corps specifically designed to be used in the coastal zone. So one of the things that I think along my tenure of doing this is that I've seen that the sort of frustration because of the use of the maintenance nationwide, the nationwide 3. If you're outside the coastal zone, you're allowed to, if you're within a previously permitted area and you're just doing maintenance, then you're allowed to, in some cases, go to work without submitting anything to anybody. In OCM's case, in the state level case, that might not be the same route you have to take. You may have to go through permitting for something that you wouldn't normally have to if you were outside the coastal zone. The other thing, OCM has a tool on their website called a self-determination tool. And what that does is you can plug in coordinates or drop a pin on a site, on a particular site, and a little text box pops up. And the little text box will say, you don't need a permit, or you need one. And what they're doing is they're looking at, just in generalities, whether you're in an area that OCM has deemed exempt from their program. So for areas, for example, that are in valid fast land, so a fast land is an area that's surrounded by levees and under pump, and anything above the 5-foot contour. So if you drop your pin in this self-determination and it meets one of those criteria, that little text box will say that you may not need a permit. So just keep in mind though, is that it's limited when it comes to, it doesn't take into account things like access. So just be careful when you're using that tool. It can be helpful to give you a kind of a general idea, but you really kind of need to look at the bigger picture. So one great thing about permitting in the coastal zone is if you have to submit a permit application, once you've submitted it, you get a permit number, and then you can use that permit number to track your permit from start to finish. You can see comments, and you can actually see anybody's permit if you have that permit number. So it's an incredibly useful tool. I use it all the time. I leave it up on my screen because it really does allow you to see a lot of really helpful information. So when you're out of the coastal zone, unfortunately, the Corps doesn't have such online tracking. You can see things like, when a public notice is published, but that's pretty much the limit of what you can see online. So if you submit a permit application, I briefly mentioned earlier that it's a joint permit application between OCM and the New Orleans District. When you submit a permit application, the way that the system is set up is that OCM is responsible for reviewing that project to see if it's complete enough to distribute it to the other agencies. So if, for example, and I'll talk a little bit about incomplete checklists in just a second, but if you get an incomplete checklist, just keep in mind that that is OCM that you're dealing with only. No one else has seen it because OCM hasn't distributed to the other agencies. So of course, when you're outside the coastal zone, you're dealing just directly with the Corps. You're going to submit everything directly to the Corps. But if you're inside, you're going to have to submit, within the coastal zone, you'll have to submit to OCM for that distribution. So it gets a little tricky. Also, if you're in the coastal zone and you have unavoidable impacts to vegetated wetlands and mitigation is required, that you're going to have to deal with both OCM and the Corps. And OCM and the Corps use a different model to assess that mitigation. So that can be a little bit more of a complex issue that you may have to deal with. And then, of course, outside the coastal zone, you would only have to deal directly with the Corps. And in both instances, you're going to have to deal with other agencies providing comments about your mitigation plan. But outside the coastal zone, the Corps makes that call, and then inside it's going to be both the Corps and OCM. So let's talk a little bit about when you first get a project and things that you can kind of keep in mind about how long it could potentially take to permit that project. So I mentioned a few minutes ago about exemptions that you can use that self-determination to see if your project falls under one of what I call a straight exemption at OCM, which is that above the 5-foot contour with an invalid fast land. There are other types of exemptions. There's a no directed significant impact, which is an exemption that allows you to what they call self-condition. So if you submit a permit application for a project that doesn't fit one of those straight exemptions and you're in the middle of a facility, there's a type of NDSI that's for an upland, which means that it's previously, there's no wetlands involved, and you may be able to get a much faster permit, what's called an NDSI determination that way. I know that there have been instances where some companies have chosen, because it's a type of exemption and because the way that the regs read, that you can actually not submit anything if you feel that you can make this NDSI determination. And of course, there's a risk to any of that, is that if you're wrong, then you might have to have a tough conversation with OCM. So if you look at your project And it's definitely not exempt for any of those reasons. There are general permits and programmatic general permits, I mentioned that a minute ago, that were designed to expedite your permit process. So if you're looking at a project and if there are any tweaks that you could potentially make to fit your project under one of these general permits or a PGP, then that's something that you may want to consider, because in theory, there's always exceptions, but in theory, the general rules, GPs and PGPs are a much faster process. So if you absolutely can't fit it under a general permit, then it sounds like it would probably be processed as a full CUP or individual permit at the Corps. So those both can be incredibly lengthy processes. So when you're planning a project, you need to kind of incorporate that extensive permitting timeline into the process to make sure that everybody's on the same page before you can start construction. I would say at this point, I'm probably going to repeat this a couple of times, that pre-application meetings are highly encouraged, especially for larger and complex projects. But I would actually recommend it if you've never done a permit in the coastal zone. And what that allows you to do is, well, in the past, you could sit down at a table and with the agencies, and you can talk about your project, you can meet the players, and you can talk about their concerns before you actually submit a permit application for all to see. And so the point of it is to get those concerns addressed, and so that permit process hopefully goes quicker and smoother, because you've already talked about all the things that the agencies might have issues with. Okay, so I talked a little bit about that incomplete checklist that OCM is responsible for sending. So what they do is they take, when you submit a permit application, they look at it to see if it's complete enough for them to make a preliminary determination of how they're going to process it, and then to distribute it to the other agencies. This is what an incomplete checklist looks like. So as you can see, I'm not going to go through everything, but as you can see, it's a pretty lengthy list. There's a link at the bottom of this presentation that if you click on it, you can actually go through it and read it. But this will give you a great idea of everything that they look for when you originally submit your permit application. So if you want to use this, when you are drafting a permit, just to make sure that you've included everything that you needed to, so you avoid that incomplete checklist, then OCM completes your project and distributes it to the other agencies so their process can begin. So, big things that I talk about a lot with people, especially that haven't done permitting in Louisiana's coastal zone, is that you have to make sure all your project details have been defined. So your access, your excavation, your temporary workspaces, everything has to be defined. Dimensions for everything has to be clearly spelled out. I want to touch a little bit about access, because I think that's pretty crucial. If you're doing work, especially in water, not only do you have to show your access to your project site, you have to show water, you have to provide water depths along the entire access route, and then you have to provide fully loaded vessel drafts. So keep that in mind when you're in your preliminary stages of planning your project, that information will be needed, so you can incorporate that into the permit figures. So also if you're working in an area where there are oysters, because I mentioned that memorandum of understanding between Wildlife and OCM, you actually have to provide oyster lease notification letters. So if you're not sure, you can actually download oyster polygons off of either Sunrise, or you can go onto Wildlife and Fisheries site. So if you get into the habit of looking, if you're working in South Louisiana in an area that's conducive to oysters, take a look and see if there's oyster leases there. That notification requirement is dependent on what kind of work you're doing. It'll depend. That'll dictate how many oyster lease holders you have to notify. Copies of those letters have to be submitted within your original submittal of your permit application, or you're going to get an incomplete checklist and they're going to send it back to you and give you a list of which ones you're missing. Another thing, again, with the memorandum of understanding with Wildlife and Fisheries, if you are doing work on one of Wildlife and Fisheries wildlife management areas, prior to submitting to OCM, a permit application, you have to get a letter of clearance from Wildlife and Fisheries. So they have to look at your project and they have to issue that letter. You take that letter and you submit it with your original permit application. If you don't, you will get an incomplete checklist and they'll send it back to you. So I mentioned a second ago about access and if you're accessing your project site in the water. So if you look at the water depths along your access route and you look at the fully loaded vessel drafts, and you determine that there's no way you can do your project without dredging or prop washing for access. If you make the determination that you have to excavate or prop wash more than 25,000 cubic yards, you have to include what's called a beneficial use of dredge material plan. Now this plan, you can do several things. You can stack the material or you can pay into their beneficial use fund. Whatever you're doing, you have to include at least a sentence or two about your plan in the permit application, or they're going to send it back to you and ask you for it as part of the incomplete checklist process. So again, I would highly recommend using that checklist as sort of just a way to double check that all the information is required. So hopefully when OCM gets that permit application, they can review it, they can deem it complete, and they can distribute it to the other agencies. So another thing to keep in mind, an NAJ or a needs alternative justification is actually required for all projects in the coastal zone. The level of effort is dependent on the impacts. So there's a step on the permit application, step 11, that asks you about ways that you've avoided or minimized impacts. Some projects, some smaller projects, if you fill that step with some pertinent information, that may be it. That may be all you have to do. In other more complex projects, you may have to provide a more in-depth analysis. I will say that OCM provides guidance for these NAJ documents on their website, and it's based on the type of work that you're doing and the impact acreage. So if you have gone through any sort of site selection or route analysis, fatal flaw analysis in the beginning, your planning stages of your project, and for example, if you've had a drill box, for example, and it's 150 by 150, and because there are vegetated wetlands, you've decreased it to 100 by 100, keep that information, because all of that is really important and can be used for this NAJ effort, because that's what they want to see. Remember, their objective is all about avoidance and minimization. So I mentioned a minute ago about the beneficial use plan, that you have to provide that information in your permit application for OCM to deem it complete. I wanted to mention it again because if you choose to pay into that fund, and the price per cubic yard fluctuates, but for example, in the past it's been $1 a cubic yard, so that's $25,000 that you may not have planned for ahead of time when you're in the planning stages of your project. So I just kind of wanted to mention that because it kind of has that hefty price tag on it. So there's hydrologic modification impact analysis. They also varying levels of effort for this one as well. It could be as simple as saying that your project is not going to impact hydrology pre or post construction. So they're really reviewing the modifications of existing hydrology in the area. OCM has a hydrologist on staff, so for the more complex projects, they're going to get him to review that analysis. I mentioned a second ago also about in the incomplete checklist about oyster and seed grounds coordination. For oyster leases, if you are within whatever buffer that Wildlife and Fisheries defines that you have to coordinate with oyster leases, you actually have to get what's called a water bottom assessment done. And an oyster biologist goes out there, they take the necessary data, they provide that data to Wildlife and Fisheries, and Wildlife and Fisheries has to approve that. OCM, based on the memorandum of understanding with Wildlife and Fisheries, OCM will actually issue their permit with conditions saying that you have to do that prior to commencement of your project. So it's not going to hold up their permit process. But for seed grounds, they will not issue until you've done that water bottom assessment, that you've sent that water bottom assessment to Wildlife and Fisheries. Wildlife and Fisheries has provided conditions for OCM to include into their permit authorization. So OCM will not issue their authorization until that seed ground report has been approved by Wildlife and Fisheries and they've received those conditions. That can be a pretty lengthy process. So I wanted to for your timing of your project, I wanted to keep that, I wanted to just let y'all know that that might be something to think about in the early stages of your project, once project details have been defined. So a couple of other things, and this is actually, even if you're working outside the coastal zone, in my professional opinion, early consultation with SHPO to determine if there are any cultural resources that may be impacted by your project. I think if you have a general area, you can start that consultation, and then potentially you can redesign your project or maybe make little tweaks to allow you to avoid those potential impacts. Which is, again, these things are discussed during the permit process, but if you can get this information ahead of time, you could potentially speed up that permit process by already addressing SHPO's concern. It's the same thing with U.S. Fish. If you run an IPAC and you see that there could potentially be an issue with a T&E species, you can start that coordination with U.S. Fish to see if there are ways to avoid or minimize those impacts. So again, all of that is addressed as early as possible. And another quick side note I wanted to make that I've seen over the years is that if you're working in an area that there could be rookeries in your area, and in South Louisiana, that's a pretty large area, then you may have to work with Wildlife and Fisheries or a biologist, or you can even look and see what other applicants did in the area to see if that rookery being there is going to restrict your construction timelines. So if there's one there and it's active, what it may do is it may push your project into the non-nesting season. So again, just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind when you're first looking at a project. So I know that was a lot of information all at once. We talked about, the key players, the information that's required, things to keep in mind. I'm going to reiterate the importance, in my opinion, of a pre-application meeting. I think it's especially for larger projects, it's critical to sort of get those things addressed up front. So when you submit your permit application, there's less going back and forth with the agencies, and hopefully it's a smoother permit process for y'all. So we have a few minutes.
Yeah, so we have our first question, and it's from Terry. And the question is, are there still USACE Section 408 reviews when necessary?
Yes, so that is actually part of the Corps' permit process. Oh, absolutely. And it's actually become a little lengthier of a process now because there's this new engineering review that wasn't there before. So yes, when you're doing, and that's both inside and outside the coastal zone. So when you're doing permitting with the Corps and there's some sort of operations interest, then yes, absolutely, you go through that 408 process.
Okay, if anyone has any questions, please use that question and answer box at the bottom, and we will try to answer it. Okay, so our next question is from Walter. He asked, what happens when mitigation is required, but there are no mitigation bank acreage available in that watershed?
So there is an in lieu fund that may be a possibility if the Corps approves the use of that at the state level. So that's definitely something that you can talk to the OCM's mitigation section about and see if that's an appropriate choice for your project. And again, my information will be at the end. If you could think of anything, after this is over, please shoot me an email and I'll get back with you as soon as I can.
Okay, there's another question from Alex, and it said, can you please touch on in lieu permits, such as when a drilling permit is needed for conservation?
So conservation is part of DNR. So in theory, that should be going hand in hand, but those are absolutely two separate permitting actions. So I know that the drilling permit is a much lengthier process. Drilling engineers, geologists, all that, those details have to be provided for that process. That's separate from OCM's permitting process.
And our next question is from Jake, and it says, for early site investigations, maybe vegetation clearing and visual inspection of sites in wetlands and the coastal zone, is a CUP necessary?
Just to go out and take a look at a site?
Vegetation clearing.
Potentially. Especially if you're attempting to clear vegetated forested wetlands, then absolutely. It really kind of depends on your site. If you're bush hogging a field and there may not be any wetlands or any other unique ecological features, then probably not. So it really kind of depends on where your project is.
Okay, the next question is also from Terry, and it says, has the USACE and OCM considered having the same mitigation models so there is no possible double mitigation?
That question is a great question. Man, I wish they did. I really do, but I don't see that in anytime soon. The WVA versus the LRAM, it's a pretty complicated process if you're trying to balance those. Hopefully, the regulatory agencies can come into an agreement on who's gonna be sort of the front runner, who's gonna be responsible. And I think a lot of times OCM is.
All right, our next question is from Kathy. And it says, when in mitigation negotiations, must the purchase come from an existing bank, or can you make an offer for any special projects that may have in planning stages but have yet to secure funds?
So my guess would be that would not be approved by the mitigation section at OCM, and only because they focus more on things that have been approved. If you want to submit a permitting responsible mitigation plan that has those details involved, that might be the only route that I can see, but I can't see that they would approve something like that.
And our next question is from Walter. He asked, how has COVID impacted permitting, productivity, and timelines at OCM and the Corps?
I think that they've extended them quite a bit. I know that there was some shuffle at OCM about working from home versus working in the office. I think they're back to a staggered time that, they're only in the office a couple of days a week. Some of them don't have computers to take home. So they're doing their work only on the days that they're sitting in the office, which might be 2 or 3 days a week. So it's absolutely slowed things down.
If anyone has any other questions, please use that Q&A box at the bottom. We'll give a few more minutes for questions.
And again, you can always email me or call me. if you think of something after this Q&A session.
Does anybody have any other questions? You have like 1 or 2 more minutes for questions. Okay, so it seems like no one has any other questions, but we have Regina's email on the slide on the screen. So feel free to give her an email or give us a call, and she'll be able to answer any questions you may have. All right, and we thank you guys for participating. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. As a reminder, this is a video recorded session, and we will upload it to our website under the resources tab.
Thank you.